All right. My talk is titled More Than Markets. And what I intend to do is to teach a little economics this evening. Do any of you have any kind of background in economics, even so much as just an economics class? A couple. Okay. So I'm going to do a little bit of teaching of economics and hopefully explaining why it is our current system is not really grasping the full economic activity that's going on within our society, because we have reduced economics to merely production and exchange, markets, in other words. So, I want to begin by saying, have any of you heard of third wayism? Okay. It's been, I think probably the biggest name associated in the evangelical world with third wayism is someone like a Tim Keller, right? It's usually what we think of, looking for a third way. But I would argue that because our modern way of understanding society, and economics, we view any third way as a kind of 50-50 compromise between, say, laissez-faire capitalism on one end of the spectrum and full-on socialism in the other. And so the idea is we get a sense like, well, we don't want full-on socialism, but there's something that doesn't quite sit well with us with a radical anarchist capitalism. So what we need is a third way, a Christian approach, which means why don't we keep our private property in our markets? That's nice, but let's have a generous welfare state, and let's call it generous justice in a book title, for example. That's a Tim Keller book title. So we have some kind of 50-50 compromise, socialism and capitalism, and let's call it Christian or third way. And I would argue that rather than looking for a compromise between the two, instead of going across the spectrum on an even plane, we actually need to go a little deeper to ask, what is economics? What I find interesting in this third wayism approach is there aren't any discussions about maybe promoting marriage, what that might do to the economic setting. What about enabling moms to be able to stay home to raise their children? How might that affect the economic situation? Encouraging more children. What do we do to do that? Instead of just thinking of ourselves as individuals in need of some sort of redistribution. I mean, can you imagine though? Tim Keller, when he was alive, in New York City, advocating a way and encouraging women in New York City to give up on career or college to stay home and promote households. That would never have flown. And of course, those kinds of recommendations never appear in any plan of third wayism, right? So, what I want to do is talk about what we have missed in modern economics that the ancients actually understood way better than us, that has given us a shallow understanding of economics and only halfway solutions to some of the problems we face. So I'm going to begin by ragging on the Enlightenment, one of my favorite pastimes, and a thread that carries through from our two previous conferences. 2 conferences ago, we talked about the Middle Ages as the Bright Ages. And then our last conference was talking about technology and its effect on the modern era and what we have lost from the Middle Ages. And so I'm going to continue that by talking negatively about the Enlightenment, at least just for a moment. The Enlightenment is often thought of as the time when we get rid of superstition and simple-mindedness of the past and we wisen up. We learn how complex things are. People give up the simplistic solutions of the past and are so much smarter. Well, people were smarter. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that the scientists of the modern age and the enlightened philosophers are dummies, but overall, the Enlightenment is more about simplification rather than embracing complexity. So whether you're talking about Copernicus, Nicholas Copernicus, who discovered that the earth is not the center of the universe, the sun is, or whether you're talking about Isaac Newton or Francis Bacon, all of these guys are coming up with discoveries that are correct and formulas for explaining how the world works, how the universe, how the laws of motion, all of that, but they are simplifying. They're coming up with a nice, elegant, simple equation or solution or explanation that kind of solves the whole problem. It's not as if those who came before them were saying, I think the earth is the center of the universe because I don't feel like I'm moving, right? And then scientists came along and say, okay, Neanderthal, just because you don't feel like you're moving, there's this thing called science, and it's much more complex than that. No, they had very complex understandings and explanations of why the Earth was in the center of the solar system, or what the laws of motion, what kept the planets in their sphere, or what constituted knowledge for that matter. When Francis Bacon comes along and says, no, knowledge is only that which is useful, that you can act upon. So it's a simplification a lot of the times. And that trend continues with an individual that we consider to be the founder of modern economics, Adam Smith, author of The Wealth of Nations, a book that came out in the same year of the Declaration of Independence, 1776. Adam Smith is given a lot of credit for being the founder of economic thought for his big tome, The Wealth of Nations. But in fact, Smith is actually just simplifying a much broader, more complex explanation of economics that had begun centuries before with Aristotle, and continuing with Augustine and Aquinas, lots of A's there, and the scholastic theologians at the School of Salamanca in Spain. So the scholastic economists understood that there were four major components to the study of economics. Okay? So since I'm going to throw around a lot of terminology tonight, I thought I'd bring the board up and write it down for those taking notes. So for the scholastics, economics consists of, first, and even though it says I'm saying first, I'm starting with the final distribution. Final distribution. That is who it is that consumes the goods, ultimately. That is the why. Why produce or exchange anything? Why do you do anything? It's for somebody, this person who's going to consume the goods. Final distribution. Secondly, utility. I'm going to define these terms in more detail as we go along. Utility. Third, exchange. And fourth, production. Final distribution, utility, kind of the how. This is your why, this is your how, and this is where we acquire things. We either produce them or exchange for them. Okay? So the scholastic, you find this in Augustine, you find this in Aquinas, you find this in the Spanish scholastics. These four components of economics. What Adam Smith does is basically eliminates this and says economics is this, exchange and production. Simply a study of how we produce things and how we exchange in the market. That's economics. He radically simplifies the scholastics. So, by eliminating utility and final distribution, Smith ends up making two mistakes. By excluding the analysis of utility, what you end up with is an inability to determine value, how much something is worth. And by eliminating final distribution, you eliminate the category of economics that is gift. Gift. That's a huge sector of economics that we don't think of as economics. That's the main focus tonight. Just when you get your child a bowl of cereal in the morning, it's a gift. There's no transaction going on there. It's economic activity, but there's no market exchange going on. So final distribution leaves out the category of gift, and utility leaves out how we determine the value of things. Why does Smith do this? Well, some of it extends from his personal and religious beliefs. Smith was not a Christian. Smith was a committed Stoic. According to Stoicism, the universe is an uncreated entity. There is no God that has brought it into being, and it's governed by one world soul. And that soul maintains the harmony and balance within the universe. So, as a good Stoic, you resign yourself to the deterministic nature of the universe, and rather than approaching economics based on the assumption that people are purposeful beings, economics instead, based on the Stoic conception, is the idea that it's governed by an invisible hand. You've probably heard of the invisible hand Adam Smith comes up with. Connected to his Stoicism. You kind of resign yourself to what will be, and it'll all balance out in the end because the market is governed, the society is governed by an invisible hand. Everyone then acts for their own self-interest. And the net result is that everyone prospers when everyone acts in their own self-interest, guided simply by the invisible hand. So, a couple of other implications for and teachings of Adam Smith. Adam Smith says, for society to run efficiently and properly, everybody looks for their own self-interest, and there needs to be no necessary agreement on our ends, our telos in life, as long as we can maintain agreement on means. Okay? So, there's some truth to this. When you go to work, you go and work as a team with coworkers that might have very different lifestyles and interests than you. What you do with your money, with your paycheck, might be very different than a coworker, but as long as you, for the 8-hour shift or whatever you're working, share the common goal about the means, we've got to get this job done, it works. And what you do in your free time is your business. What they do in theirs is theirs. You may not hang out outside of work. You don't have to agree on ends. Simple agreement on means, which is true. However, if you use that as a kind of standard for all society, what happens when your ends, the society's ends, are mutually exclusive? How does a society function when you have a, say, just plot of land, and the decision is we want to build a church there, or a casino there, or a strip club there, or a grocery store there? Who gets to decide what we do with this property? Well, the market decides, right? The highest bidder. And we say, well, that's fair, and we move on, as if the outcome of that decision will not erode the foundation on which that freedom of exchange takes place. Right? So having radically different ends for a society is not going to, that society might continue for a period of time, but you could be making radically different decisions that erode the very nature to have freedom of exchange. Right? Second, how do you determine value? Now that you're not discussing utility, how do we know how much anything is worth in an exchange? Well, Adam Smith comes up with this idea. To determine value, he says, it must be labor. Labor, it's the labor that goes into a thing or a service that accounts for its value. And this is known as the labor theory of value. The more work you put into something, the more valuable it is. That's the idea. Well, it's going to be very problematic within about 6-7 decades of Adam Smith. Because Adam Smith and his followers, his disciples, and those who come after him, David Ricardo and others, are going to continue arguing that line, labor theory of value, and then there's going to be a guy who comes along by the name of Karl Marx. And Karl Marx is going to take the labor theory of value to its logical conclusion. And he's going to say, if the value of any good or service is the amount of labor that goes into it, and the workers are putting in the labor, and let's say we have a product X, and it takes 10 hours to produce this at $10 an hour, and that means it's worth $100. But you go to the store and find it is at the store for $130. How do we explain this? Marx is going to say the capitalist bourgeoisie owner is extracting surplus value. Because the real value of that thing, if you could sell this for $130, it's $130, and the value comes from the labor that's put into it, and you're only paying the worker $10, and you're extracting $30 for nothing. You didn't put any labor into this, business owner. You're robbing the surplus value from the worker. The worker should have been paid $12, $13 an hour, whatever it was that this sells for. And so this gap between the 100 and the 130 is surplus value being extracted by the capitalist who has contributed nothing to this because of value. The value comes from the labor. And thus you get Marxism. Right? The bourgeoisie or the proletariat needs to overthrow the bourgeoisie that is exploiting them by extracting surplus value. Okay? But Marx didn't pull that out of his hat. Marx was drawing on our favorite capitalist, Adam Smith, who makes this mistake because he left out utility in simplifying economics. So, in the 1870s, shortly after Marx has published the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, in the 1870s, in Europe, there occurs a major event in the economic world known as the Marginal Revolution, due to the discovery of the principle of marginal utility. And it was discovered semi-independently, by a handful of economists. They weren't working together. They were from different countries. One, Karl Menger from Austria. Another, William Stanley Jevons from England. And yet another, Leon Walras from France. All start coming to different versions of what becomes known as the principle of marginal utility. Bringing this back. Recovering this principle of utility that had been lost. And so what is marginal utility? So I'll try to give an illustration to explain it real quickly. Marginal utility is how we determine price and value of goods. And how we do that is we have to take our eyes away from the particular commodity and thinking of it as a whole, and we got to break it down into units. So instead of thinking, what is the price of water? What is the price of corn? What is the price of gas in the abstract, as if there's one standard value to all of these things, we have to think of them in terms of bushels of corn, gallons of gas, gallons of water, liters of water, in terms of units. Okay? So think of it this way. Let's say you were maybe traveling to this conference from a long way, and you forgot to get gas at your last stop, and you realize you're running on empty, and you're out in the middle of nowhere, and there's no gas stations in sight, and you hear the car start to stall out, and you pull over to the side of the road. And you think, great, how far am I going to have to walk to find gas and bring it back here? Man, this ruins the whole trip. And lo and behold, someone pulls right up beside you and says, hey, you all right? I happen to have a ton of gas in the back. I just have gallons of gas I'm hauling around. I'm willing to sell you. How much, let's say your car gets 30 miles to the gallon. How much are you going to be willing to pay in that circumstance for the first gallon of gas? Maybe the number's different in each of your minds, but let's settle for way more than any of the current gas prices you'd find, right? You'd probably be willing to pay $30 a gallon. $50 a gallon. It's going to save you walking, I don't know how many miles, finding a gas can, walking back, right? If you can get it right now, you're going to pay a lot for that first gallon. What about the second gallon? The first gallon gets you 30 miles, and likely you'll find a gas station within 30 miles. Depends on where you're driving. Maybe out in the far west. It's a different story. But maybe you'd feel a little more security if you went ahead and bought 2 gallons. Because that ensures you at least 60 miles, puts your mind more at peace. Maybe for the second gallon, you'd be willing to spend $25. How about for the third gallon? Maybe not as much. How about the 10th gallon? Fill it all up here. You probably aren't going to be willing to pay anything for that 10th gallon. And if it's a 10-gallon tank, an 11th gallon just to have extra, you're probably not going to be willing to pay anything for that at all, right? Because chances are you can find a gas station within the next so many miles and pay way less than $30, $25, $20, $15 a gallon. You can pay a normal price, right? So if I asked you, based on that example, what's the value of gas? What's the just price of gas? It depends on which gallon we're talking about, right? So it's not gas, the price of gas. It depends on where you are. In that situation, gas is very valuable to you, especially that first gallon. While you're sitting at a gas station with your car full, gas isn't worth anything to you. That you're not going to be willing to pay anything for that, right? So what is the price of gas? There is no price of gas. You have to break it down into units. It's based on the utility of particular gallons. Okay? So utility comes back in with the marginal revolution. Great discovery. Rediscovery, I should say, by those like Carl Menger and William Stanley Jevons. But there's still a problem. Because as this new theory could be referred to as neoclassical economics, or some Austrian economics, particularly the Menger branch from Austria, there's still a problem here, because now what the equation looks like is something like this. You produce P or exchange, okay, in order to acquire goods and services, and you make decisions based on utility to determine value, good. Toward the end, which is yourself. Okay? So produce or exchange in order, and then use utility to deter utility. That's goods, that could be people, that could be anything. Everything around you serves a utilitarian purpose toward the end of creating your happiness. Okay? Yourself, you are the end of every economic decision. So, got a couple of quotes just to illustrate this from someone like Ludwig von Mises. If you've ever heard of Ludwig von Mises, considered the father of the Austrian School of Economics. Mises says, all action is based on reason. Action, therefore, which is understood by reason, knows only one end, the greatest pleasure of the acting individual. The attainment of pleasure, the avoidance of pain, these are its intentions. All action, all human action, is aimed at the end of greater pleasure and avoidance of pain. And I don't mean to use these terms crudely. When you think of greater pleasure, I'm not talking about just chocolate cake or something like that, and pain like, oh, torture. He's using these in broad categories. They could include, pleasure could include even charitable donations. If you want to donate to someone, what he's saying is everything that you do, whether it's personally selfish or not, you do because it increases your pleasure. It makes you happy. And everything you avoid is because it causes you some kind of pain or uncomfortability, and that is the end of all human action. And he says, you can't even avoid this. So even if you think you're doing something for someone else, you're really doing it for you because, you're doing a job because, it's on your wife's to-do list or something. You're doing it anyway for you because it's better than the alternative, or your wife being mad at you because you didn't get the job done, right? So all human action is toward the end of pursuing one's pleasure or happiness and avoiding pain, okay? And furthermore, all human action is an exchange. All human action is an exchange because you are, even if you are on an island by yourself, anytime you do anything, you are exchanging one set of circumstances for another. So, in Mises' view, the end, the telos of all action is pleasure and avoidance of pain, and all action is some kind of exchange, like a market exchange, even if nothing more than exchanging one set of circumstances for another. I'm hungry, I want a sandwich. I get up, I make a sandwich. I have exchanged my situation without a sandwich for a situation in which I now have a sandwich. I eat it, I feel pleasure from that, I am no longer hungry. That is economic activity, and it's couched in the terms of exchange. Okay? So, everything you do is based on utility, and utility concerns even humans. Okay? Humans also function as a means to the end of your happiness. All right. So, this is where we get into gift. Neoclassical economics, or Austrian economics, failed to address final distribution. Who is it that consumes? Who is the economic activity for? They say it's for your own pleasure, whatever you do. However, a vast amount of economic activity that we engage in on any given day is gift giving. Stop and think about it. How much of what you do, or how much of what you earn when you go to work, do you personally consume? Why do you go to work? How much activity do we miss by excluding the category of gift? How much wealth that we produce or exchange is actually given away? Just think about how much kids cost, right? Just think about throughout the day how much you give away. How much do you personally consume of what you earn or exchange? Now, the right, political right, when they think about economics, they like to think of something like Frank Sinatra's old song. I did it my way. I picked myself up by my bootstraps. I earned and I did things my way. I made it. The left likes to think of it in terms of, like Obama said a few years ago, you didn't build that. Right? So therefore, and the implication of you didn't build that is, give me some. Since you didn't build it all yourself, you didn't do it all your way, give me some. Okay? But both sides view society as consisting of mere individuals, and economics as merely production and exchange. We total up what we produce, and we exchange with each other, and we call those exchanges, the cumulative effect of them, GDP. And we measure wealth that way. Production, exchange, total it all up, we call it GDP. But what if most of the economic activity that we engage in is not counted in GDP numbers? It's given as gift. So, I want to give you two different models to illustrate this. If any of you have read any economics books, it's very common to find concepts illustrated by the story of Robinson Crusoe. You begin with the assumption Robinson Crusoe, an individual on an island. What do? You begin your economic activity by finding food. Right? You've got to sustain yourself for the next day. You put some nets together, try to fish, try to find berries, and then once you have a stock of food, then you move on to shelter, right? So that you don't have to spend the next day hunting or gathering food. You can work the next day on shelter, and then you can work the next day on whatever else. And you keep building until you have created for yourself a nice, comfortable, sustainable place to live. Okay. A lot of economics books use that as an illustration, the Robinson Crusoe illustration. I don't know about you, but I've never been stuck alone on an island, and I would guess most people haven't either. But I would imagine there's probably another model that would be closer to home, closer to our experience. And actually there is. Consider this. This was an example created by another economist. His name was Philip Wicksteed, early 1900s. And this he called the mother's milk problem. In the usual routine, milk may be wanted in the household for the baby, for the other children, for a pudding, for tea or coffee, and for the cat. When deciding how the remaining milk in the house is allocated, it is the baby who will drink first and to the full. Then the older children will get what they need for their cereal. Then the adults will get what they need for their coffee or tea. Then, if there's any left over, the cat will get some in the saucer. Question: why does the baby take precedence over everyone else? Is it because the baby offers the best price in exchange for the milk? They put the milk up for a bid, and the baby came up with the highest bid, and the baby gets the milk first. Is it because the mom gains more pleasure Using this model, the mom gains more pleasure by the baby enjoying the milk than she gets from the kids enjoying the milk or from giving it to the cat or for putting it in her coffee. Is there more pleasure acquired by the mom because the baby gets the milk first? Is that what makes her happier? We can make, hopefully you're starting to see the problem. We can make 2 points here. There's a hierarchy of importance based on loves and based on scarcity. First, on loves. The cat is the lowest priority because the cat is a lower order and is not loved as much as the children. In fact, if the price of milk goes up or the income shrinks, guess who's getting their milk cut first, right? The cat. The cat's not going to get any milk. That's going to be the first to go. The mother will buy less of it and just spread her supply among the other 3 or 4 categories. The children, the mother loves equally. It's not that she loves the baby more, but there is this reality of scarcity. There's only so much milk at that price. And so the principle of scarcity has to kick in and say, who is in most need of it? The mother perhaps wishes she could let all the children drink their fill of milk, but she must utilize her resources in such a way that those for whom the milk is most necessary will receive it. She's making decisions based on seeing human beings. In other words, this is key. She's making these decisions by seeing human beings as ends and not means of her happiness. Make sense? I'm happier if the baby gets the milk. It fills me up more, right? I feel more pleasure. No, she's seeing all of these other human beings as the ends for which she produces or buys the milk and makes decisions about how to ration it. Because the other human beings are the ends, she is not the end. This is gift. She is giving gifts. Using the principle of utility and giving gifts to her children or to her cat in various measures. This is economic activity. But the kids aren't making payments. They're not exchanging. They're not saying, oh, we will love you and honor you if you give us the milk. It's not a transaction. It is a gift. So, what's wrong with neoclassical economics? This Robinson Crusoe model? We don't exist on islands and then build communities up around us. We are born into societies, members of communities, members of families, and we engage in all kinds of economic activity throughout our lives without realizing it. We are beneficiaries of gifts for a long time before we ever become productive. Before our activity ever registers in GDP numbers. Furthermore, we are, as Aristotle and as Augustine and as Aquinas and as the scholastics knew, human beings, we are social creatures, relational beings, we are matrimonial beings. We are conjugal beings by nature. Let me just share with you from, for example, from Aristotle. Between man and wife, a natural friendship seems to exist, for they are more inclined by nature to conjugal than political society. This is so because the home is older and more necessary than the state, and because generation is common to all animals. Only to this extent do animals come together. Men, however, cohabit not only to procreate children, but also to have whatever is needed for life. Indeed, from the beginning, family duties are distinct Some are distinct. Some are proper to husband, others to the wife. Thus, mutual needs are provided for when each contributes to his own services, contributes his own services to the common good. Therefore, this friendship seems to possess both utility and pleasure, but it can exist for the sake of virtue if the husband and wife are virtuous, for each has his proper virtue and they can delight in it. Children seem to be a bond of union, hence sterile couples separate more readily, for children are a common good of both parties, and what is common maintains friendship. So what Aristotle is saying, and those like Aquinas and Augustine would also, this was a common teaching in the Middle Ages, is that by nature human beings are conjugal. We could go back to Genesis 1 and 2, right? That it is woman that is made from man, not man over here made from the dust of the earth and woman made from the dust of the earth, and both are on islands and they happen to come together, right? They are made for each other. They come together by nature because we are conjugal. We are matrimonial beings. So with that, another illustration. Two kids want to start a business, the classic American business, the lemonade stand on their street. Johnny and Billy. Johnny says, well, I have a lot of money for my allowance, but not a lot of time right now. I can put up the capital to buy the supplies that we need, but you need to be the one to sit at the lemonade stand and, take the orders and mix the drink and supply it. So they work out the deal, 50-50 split. One provides the capital, the other provides the labor. And after a week, they total up their earnings. They've made $100, split it 50-50. In that very basic illustration, we can see human capital, Billy sitting at the lemonade stand, and non-human capital, Johnny supplying the money that buys the supplies, the table, and all of that at work. And the capital is utilized by laborers who produce a profit. And take that and multiply it out by 1 million or 1 billion times, and you have the basis of economy. Global, national, local, whatever, of any size. But here's the question that's often missed. Where did the human capital come from? The human capital, those two boys, did they just come out of nowhere to engage in economic activity that benefited customers? Did they just come out of the ether? Where did the physical capital come? Where did the money come from that was saved up? My point here is that capital, human capital or otherwise, is not something we should just take for granted. Two boys, like I did, two boys go enter into an economic enterprise, produce, there's wealth creation. Now multiply over and over. What if those boys don't show up? What if those boys aren't there because they were never born? What if the policies of a nation, because they don't think about gift, they don't think about final distribution, never find it in their economic interest to have those children that would go on to produce more wealth and satisfy more customers, and then go on to have children and produce more wealth and satisfy more customers. It's been said history belongs to those who show up for it. And yet, many of our policies are all based on the Robinson Crusoe model. Individuals on an island who engage in activity, production and exchange, for the purpose of fulfilling their own happiness. And maybe for somebody it fulfills their own happiness to have children. And if it doesn't, if the costs don't outweigh the benefits, we simply don't. And the assumption is we'll all still be fine. We'll all still continue. It'll all still continue to work just fine. Because we don't understand all this economic activity that is being missed in terms of what it means to have children, to raise children, all the gifts that have to be given to supply that human capital and physical capital for the next generation. And this is where we come back into generational wealth. If we are thinking in terms of wealth as how do we increase our productivity or exchange so we can make more money, increase our GDP today, we are missing out on a whole lot of economic activity that we already do that is necessary to continue engaging in economic activity in the future. Last illustration, just to drive this point home. Take a young man. He graduates high school, goes into the workforce, or graduates college, goes into the workforce, gets a job. He's getting a paycheck. He's engaging in economic activity that is measured. Then he decides to get married. Keeps that job. But his wife, he now has a wife. He is not working just for his own end anymore. He's working for a shared end, right? Another person that he has to supply, has to care for. She is also contributing some kind of economic activity, even if she doesn't have a job, in the home.